So much. I hope this is on great. Well, I before I launch my talk, let me just say something relevant that flows from the Jean Vron mentioned the increase in mortality for people after their spouses die, and Caleb Stoll earlier today made the comment that women stay longer in SNFs because there's no one at home to take care of them. I'm going to allude a little bit to the work of Nicholas Christakis, social network science guy. But one of his earliest, he was a palliative care physician before he got into studying social networks, and he was the one who described the increase in mortality for people after their spouse dies. But if you actually go back and look at what his data show, when women die, their husbands have an 8% increase in mortality. But when men die, their wives do not. Their wives go on just fine. So, I don't know what that means, but I think somehow is tied to Caleb's observation that, the men aren't doing anything. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I've learned a lot today. And I think just to sort of one reason why I came out here is because I never say no to Amy Compton Phillips. But another reason is, I want you to understand how important Providence St. Joe's is to the rest of the country in terms of like showing where healthcare should go. And and how the work that you do making Providence St. Joe's better in the future is so important. To be a little bit of a shameless name dropper, at the end of July, I was part of a small dinner with Bill Gates, and every Monday evening he has what he calls a learning session, and his staff rounds up 8 people to talk with him about a topic that he's interested in learning more about and having conversation. And it was U.S. healthcare on that particular night. And so he had me, the group is Toby Cosgrove, Rebecca Oni, Lamore Daphne, Pat Conway, a few others. And at one point we were talking about how physicians get paid and stuff at one point in the evening. We talked about everything. And we, someone said, okay, let's pick 5 systems that we really admire, that we have something to learn from here. And there was consensus that immediately emerged before we got into the details of how physicians get paid in them. But I can tell you the 5 systems, not no particular order, but they weren't ranked, were Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Intermountain, Kaiser Permanente, and Providence St. Joe's. So what you guys do is really of interest. They didn't mention the Brigham or Mass General, where I take care of patients and where I spent most of my career. Now, that said, I think that in terms of the challenge it faces, I think Jens crystallized things beautifully at the end where he said, we don't know what to do. For most individual patients, for many of the challenges, it may feel like we don't know what to do. But the fact is, I do believe that we have the elements of what we need to know to chart a path forward, to know what we should be trying to do in our work in the days and weeks and months ahead, and to try to lay out that path forward in the uncertain situations that we face, in terms of the marketplace, the uncertain situations of our individual patients. What I'm going to try to do is draw upon the ideas of 5 of the biggest influences on me. One of whom I don't even know personally, but they're people who have been big influences. Some of them, 3 of them are friends and co-authors, but these are just they're not the only 5 big great thought leaders, but I think that there are interesting things to take away, sort of providing a framework for how to think about the work that we have in front of us. And it's not just, I'm not going to be just doing a medley of greatest hits, although it will seem like I'm singing a medley of greatest hits by other people. It's how they fit together that I'm going to try to get to the end, that I hope will give you a sense of, as you go forward in your work, the bigger picture and of what we all have to do collectively and what many of you will want to take on individually. Now, the reason why I want to do this is that because I know how uncertain everything is. And, there are, I don't quote Donald Rumsfeld very much, but this one quote of his, is an important one. It does get quoted a lot, that there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And regardless of how things go with the upcoming elections and the healthcare marketplace, we do know this, which is, market share is critical. If you don't have patients, it's very tough to be successful. And that improving the value of care helps you win market share. And value is not that complicated. It really is. It's meeting patients' needs, and it's doing so as efficiently as possible. I think Amy's refinement at the beginning was excellent, and I think that regardless of that is even if you can't measure value with like an equation and numbers, when you're improving it. You're improving it if you're doing something better in the numerator. You're improving it if you're doing something better in the denominator. And ideally, you're doing both. And as you've seen today, the Portland, Oregon cardiac surgery consolidation showed you can do both at the same time. But that is the goal. If improving value, that is our path forward. But doing that is complicated. It's actually, complicated is not the right word. Complex is the right word. And now when I say complex, there is a framework for thinking about problems, which probably many of you know, which is, there are obvious problems where what you do, 4 categories of problems. There are obvious ones. What you should do is obvious, and then you do it. Then there are complicated problems where many people must do many things, but if everyone does their thing, it probably comes out just fine. Then there are complex problems, and those are the kind that we face all the time now, where there are multiple intertwined issues going on, and it's very difficult to even lay out how they're intertwined and predict what will happen. But one thing you can predict is that if you only do one thing with a complex problem, almost surely you'll see no impact. And probably everyone here has experienced trying something that you thought would make care better or more efficient, and there was no impact. And that's usually because it's a complex problem, and there is no single magic bullet. So we need multiple streams of work, multiple solutions at multiple levels if we're going to affect real change in performance. Now, as I said, I am actually better at, I'm not joking here, I'm really better at gossip than I am at ideas. And so it's easier for me to think about 5 people and lessons to take away from them, what I associate with these people. And that might be a reasonable thing for some of you as well. So these 5 are my, greatest hits authors. And I'm going to tick through, I'm going to spend more time with Michael Porter than the other ones, but the other ones are also, big thought leaders. And as it is, if Michael Porter knew I was summarizing all of his work in 7 minutes, he would kill me. But Michael Porter is the guy from whom I've learned about strategy, what the meaning of strategy. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit. Basically, what should we do? Limor Daphne is an economist and also a professor at Harvard Business School. She's the one who taught me with some very painful lessons about why we should do it. What's it going to take to get us to do it? From her, I learned about competition. And I think we need them both. We need, Porter, I think, gives you the recipe of what we should do. Limor teaches you how do you bring the heat into the kitchen so you might actually cook something. But then how do we make it a meal that any of us want to serve or want to eat ourselves? That's where, moving internal to the organization, where most of you work, that's where the influences of the other 3 are important. So Ronald Byrd, who's the one I've never actually met, but I've emailed with him once or twice. He's a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and his work has sort of taught me the basics of social capital, and I'll talk into what that means. Nicholas Christakis, a social network scientist, the palliative care physician who found, who identified the stuff about widows and widowers, or at least widowers dying sooner after their spouse dies. I'm going to summarize a little bit of his work by talking about social norms. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff from Angela Duckworth, the Penn psychologist who is the expert on grit. And then I'll talk about how they all fit together. All right, so I don't have an MBA, or, I sort of learned this stuff on the job when I'm working in senior management at Partners Healthcare. And I learned, frankly, I've learned, now that I think about it, most of what I've learned from these 5 people is because they were directly or indirectly criticizing me and banging away at me and the work that I was doing. And I got to know Michael Porter when he was, he basically, my job with partners was to try to integrate the care, trying to make us, greater than the sum of his parts. And Michael Porter, we heard, was out there saying that partners was not really an integrated care system. And we thought, that's not good. And so my boss, Jim Mongan, and I invited him over for lunch, and we talked about the great things we're doing. And he was very respectful and polite. And he said, well, that's lovely. And this was the day I learned that when someone says lovely in a business context is not good, because what's coming next is but. And he said, but that's not the same thing as organizing care around patients. And as soon as he don't have great operational effectiveness, you might as well give up, because you're not going to be in the game. In the past, when there was more and more money flowing into healthcare to meet the rising cost for what we did, basically, if you did good operational effectiveness, you were going to be fine. If you had a good brand and people were coming to you and you're filling your beds, filling your office schedules, you could pretty much, if you did a good job, you could pretty much get from the marketplace what you needed to have a margin and thrive. And you still need operational effectiveness today, but it won't be enough. It's table stakes today. It'll enable you to survive. If you want to thrive, we believe you need strategy. And so that this is why we wrote this article, because strategy is not about the upper stuff. It's about making choices about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Strategy boils down to basically 2 simple questions. I mean, Mike is often credited with sort of inventing the modern concepts of strategy for business during the 80s and 90s. And he boils it down to 2 simple questions: having clarity, complete clarity, on what you're trying to do for whom. Who's your customer, how you're making things better for that customer. And then the second key question is, how are you going to make things different? How are you going to be different? If you're doing the same thing for everyone, the same way as everyone else is, well, inevitably you're just going to be in a price war. Eventually, markets work. And you're going to be in a price war, there'll be no margin, and you won't be able to thrive. You may stay alive, but you can't thrive. So you're going to have to make choices if you're going to do well, and your choices should be guided by these 2 questions. With that in mind, so Mike and I wrote this article in 2013 at Harvard Business Review, The Strategy That Will Fix Healthcare. The title is grandiose. We didn't write it. It was the folks at Harvard Business Review who wrote it. But basically, it was a strategic framework. Now, let me say, since it's the end of the afternoon and people are here giving up their time because hopefully, their futures might go slightly different courses because of it. Let me say how Mike got to be thinking about where the phrase strategic framework came from, why Mike sort of invented that phrase, and this is how it came to be. In the 80s, he was getting a PhD in economics, and he was getting an MBA. And he realized both kinds of learnings were interesting, but they didn't answer the question that he was really interested in. And frankly, the question I think all of you are interested in, which is, what should we do? What should the CEO do? What should leaders of a group do? On one hand, he was doing traditional academic research papers, does exposure A lead to outcome B, adjusting for all these different things. And it was interesting, but it was oversimplified. It was too simple to actually tell you what to do because, that's not, just because something drives something doesn't mean you put all your resources into that. Then in the business school, he was running around getting experience. He was reading cases, going to places, learning what they went through, learning how they managed crises, learning what judgment was. And judgment is important. But judgment about how do you handle crises, how do you react, that's not the same thing as what should we do. So Mike was interested in that question of what should we do. And that's kind of why you guys are here, is to sharpen your, basically begin to help you begin to be leaders of like for your parts of the organization about what should you be doing. So Mike felt that that should be guided by strategic frameworks where you lay out an array of ideas that basically are robust in their relationship with each other. If you this is what we published in our 2013 paper. Mike's first strategic framework was the 5 forces, and there's a lot more to this work, but basically it's a set of ideas. So, it's the key thing to take away from this is not a menu in a restaurant. It's not like if you do one thing, almost surely nothing will happen. But if you do multiple things, probably something will happen. And so organizing into real teams, integrated practice units, which I'm going to say a little bit more about shortly. Measure the outcomes that really matter for the performance you want, for the customer you want, what Caleb and Jacob were talking about at the beginning, and the cost for every patient. Moving toward bundled payments and other kinds of incentives that reward you for performance. If you do any one of those things, nothing happens. If you do all 3 of those things, stuff like, look at Hogue, stuff has really happened here because you put together all 3 of those things. I won't go into the others, but that's the key thing that, is a framework where you're doing multiple thing matters. Well, I'm going to say a little bit about this thing about IPUs because I think that it'll crack you up. I mean, we actually wrote this in NEGM Catalyst paper article just a few weeks ago because at one of those Sunday afternoons, I sit with Mike a lot, and Mike makes everyone say IPU. I keep saying team, and he corrects me. He goes, IPU. And I sort of roll my eyes and go, IPU. And finally, one Sunday, I said to him, Mike, why do you make everyone say IPU? And he goes, well, because it reminds me of SBU. And I said, you are making everyone say IPU because it reminds you of something else and they don't even know it. And he said, kind of. And I go, what is an SBU? So this is what came out. So, how many of you know what an SBU is? Okay, a few of you. I didn't know. So, okay, so what Mike said and what we wrote into an article was that, a century ago, U.S. business was undergoing organizational change analogous to what we're going through now, and it led to epic improvements in performance. The old model, going back to the 19th century of business, was, you organized around functions, manufacturing, sales, marketing. But that's because in that era, the products were simple. Businesses were simple. You were making simple products for like one customer. But then there was this wave of innovation that's analogous to the wave of innovation that we've been enjoying in healthcare. Where there, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, and then, many, many other advances to enable mass production of things and transportation of goods over long distances. so that it became a much better world. And businesses became kind of like our healthcare organizations today. They became large multi-product, multi-customer organizations, and the products themselves were much more complicated. So like my favorite little example was DuPont, which went from being a little chemical company to, by the end of World War I, they're making gunpowder, they're making tires for trucks and automobiles, because suddenly there are roads all over America. They're making nylon stockings. It was the Roaring '20s. And they went through this phase where they were organized in the old way. So like their marketing group was marketing explosives and nylon stockings. And it's hard to be good at doing all those things. So what evolved over the next few decades was that a reorganization around groups of customers. They were turning into their hubs, within big conglomerates. And so SBUs, the phrase SBUs were these groups within bigger organizations that were focused on groups of customers, groups of products. And GE Aircraft actually has multiple IPUs within GE Aircraft. I mean, GE is having a tough time now, but they had a good run, and a big part of their run was organizing around customers, GE Aircraft engines, aircraft bodies, and so on and so on. So that is what we think is happening in healthcare today. We think Providence St. Joe's is, among the country's leaders in moving down this road, organizing around patients instead of functions, having teams that are real teams instead of pickup teams. Now, I don't need to beat this to death because you've been sort of hearing about healthcare moving this direction. That is why Providence St. Joe's and Amy, are organized this program, was to be moving down the road of organizing around customers. Now, okay, but what will make us do it? What will actually make us turn the integration that is possible in these big organizations into something that really produces value for customers? Well, I'm going to be quick on this. I mean, Limor Daphne and I, we published this article in HBR on the framework for what will drive competition. As you can tell, my academic life is a low budget operation. I just took the figure from my Porter paper, changed the colors, and put different things in. There were going to be the same number of balls on this framework as there were in the Porter thing, because there's no way I was drawing all those little arrows again. But I basically, I think the path forward, what I've learned from her is that competition is inherently good. I've learned from Porter strategy is inherently good. I used to think integration of care was inherently good. I now feel that integration is potentially good if its potential is unlocked by competition, if it's used with strategy. I mean, strategy is when you spend time thinking about what will produce value for patients. That's inherently good. Competition probably you're ambivalent about, but when you think about the fact that everyone wants competition for everyone else other than themselves, you can see how it's good when everyone else is competition. That probably means competition is good for us too. And I say that because I think the right thing is, if you buy that, is to plunge into competition. That's why I asked Jen after her talk this morning to write something for NEJM Catalyst on how we pitch bundles. I want to make that, I want to fill everyone else out there with fear and start to compete in the same way. Now, we think we need competition where people try to get better because they're afraid of losing business if they don't. I think that the behavioral economics stuff applies to fear of losing business. It really is a powerful motivator. I think it's inherently good. Now, I think competition, there's not one marketplace in healthcare. There are multiple marketplaces. We need competition at every level. We need competition when consumers pick their health plans. We need competition when patients pick their doctors. And then, the answer to the question that David asked in the last panel about how do we make sure there aren't too many bundles, frankly, we need physicians, ACOs to be the purchasers of care, deciding whether or not they want to buy bundles or not. That's what will prevent there from being unnecessary bundles. And nothing's perfect. Competition will have its unintended consequences like anything else will. But of course, doing nothing will have unintended consequences. The alternative to market-driven competition, regulation, that is going to have lots of unintended consequences too. It's taking very, very big hammers for relatively small nails. Now, because we're short on time, I'm gonna skip over some of the stuff, but I feel like the barriers to competition are falling, basically. So let me turn to like how we respond. We within Providence St. Joe, we within other provider organizations. So here's the first thing I want to talk about is social capital. So social capital, these are okay, we all know what financial capital is. That's the money that enables Providence St. Joe's and Hoag to build buildings and do things it couldn't otherwise do. We know what human capital is, hiring good people. But social capital is the relationships among those people, and the relationships between those people and the infrastructure they interact with that enables organizations to accomplish things they otherwise could not. There are two ways to build social capital. One is brokerage, where you actually increase variation within organizations. You nurture new ideas. You bring in ideas from other places. That is why you are here. Is building social capital by spreading ideas. Amy's work spreading things at scale is so important to healthcare itself, not just Providence St. Joe's, but it's very important to Providence St. Joe's. Closure is where you reduce variation, where you're going to say, okay, this is better, and we are going to all do it, and we're not going to have exceptions. And in order to do that, one of the things you need is trust. And Ronald Burt, like when I first read it, he's got this little book on brokerage and closure, an introduction to social capital. And in the introduction where I just read that, he said, trust is, confidence, you'll be treated fairly in situations you have not even thought of yet. When I read that, I thought, oh, this guy knows something that's really important. So the currency of social capital, these are words that were frankly rhetorical flourishes for me a decade ago, I think. But now I feel like they're operational imperatives, and not just me. I mean, I just came from our meeting, NEJM Catalyst meeting at New York Presbyterian. They are making trust and respect among their workforce, one of their major focuses for the last several years they have. They're in New York. They've got New Yorkers yelling at each other right in front of patients, and you can imagine how what that does for patients, confidence. They're getting the best care they can. Cooperation, teamwork. So these are relationships among people. Now, teamwork is one of the most important forms of social capital. And given the time, I'm not going to go really into this Team of Teams book, which is it's not a healthcare book. It comes from Stanley McChrystal from the military, talking about the worldwide campaign against Al-Qaeda. But the bottom line thing I want to say about teams is, when I was starting my career in like the 80s and doing cardiology, and there was this great surgeon, Larry Cohn, and we were talking about teams, and he said, and someone said, what is a team? And he said, and he was saying this, and he wasn't joking. He said, a team is a bunch of non-physicians who does what I want them to do, even if I'm not there to tell them. And that he meant it, and that was reasonable in that era. More recently, people have talked about teams like a multidisciplinary mix that enables everyone to practice at the top of their license, and that's a step in the right direction too. But now I think people are understanding teams are something more. Teams should be a unit like, frankly, a Navy SEAL team or a great sports team, where everyone feels collective ownership of the goal, trying to get better, trying to meet patients' needs. And that sense of, in this book on the Navy SEAL training, page 126, I can tell you, McChrystal writes that, they send off the SEALs not to create super soldiers, but to create super teams. That's what their training's all about. Like this business about keeping each other awake for 72 hours. It's all about building the sense of group ownership of a shared mission. That's what we need our teams to be like. Now, to have great teams, you need great team members. As you can see, I'm racing through my greatest hits medley. There's a lot to say about all this stuff. Christakis is the guy who this is from his famous paper in the New England Journal showing that how obesity spreads from person to person to person, how if a friend of a friend of yours gains weight, you're more likely to gain weight than, even if you don't know the friend of a friend. And that's because norms are developing around us all the time. So Nicholas is, Nicholas has shown that social networks are agnostic. They can spread bad values. They can spread racism, anti-Semitism, hatred. But they can spread good values too: altruism, charitable giving, and so on. So one of the major focuses for Providence St. Joe's is, a wonderful mission-driven system, is trying to spread the right values. The kind of values norms we need in healthcare, so we can have teams that also are great: empathy, coordination, communication, safety, excellence. That is a lot of the kind of work that you do. The CEO doesn't spread those norms. It is like the middle management, the people, the nursing unit leaders, and so on, who are absolutely critical. The CEO sets a tone, but ultimately you need it throughout the organization. And then the last one is, I want to wrap up with, is Angela Duckworth, who is the psychologist at Penn. She is the rock star in Grit. She has that famous TED Talk and MacArthur Prize. So, and as some of you know, Angela's my cousin, she's like 15 years younger. And as I told some, paid no attention to her until she won a MacArthur Prize, and then she became my favorite cousin. So we've just written something which I'll allude to very quickly, but grit is something beyond resilience, and what she, has written about in her work is like, two key ingredients are passion and perseverance to push for improvement over a sustained period. And she sort of breaks down the psychological assets, and which I won't dwell on now. Probably a lot of you know this, but we just had published, in the current issue of Harvard Business Review, this article on organizational grit. And I know you can't read the figures. You now know I make my own PowerPoints. But there are four key, what we say in this paper is that healthcare has survived in the past by having gritty individuals, physicians who will work really hard, nurses who will work really hard, who won't leave won't get rattled when, upsetting things happen. But having gritty individuals today is not enough. We need teams that behave like macrocosms of gritty individuals, and we need organizations that behave like macrocosms of gritty individuals too. And so what we write about in this paper is the four key elements that we're focusing on, our little framework, that we need at all four levels. And what we explore at all four levels first is having a goal hierarchy. So a goal hierarchy is, you've got, low-level goals that are like your to-do list, the things you've got to do. Like, probably many of you were here today because you were excited to be here, but probably some of you are here today because like a gun was held to your head and you were made to go here. You should, I hope you can see how coming here today and other things that you have to do track up to middle-level goals, and those middle-level goals track up to some high-level goal that is about what you feel like you're about. It makes you feel better if you're making progress toward that. So many of you have seen the famous Simon Sinek TED Talk, Why, How, What. The top-level goal is really the why, what makes you feel good about yourself. And so understanding the hierarchy, how things track up, the less inconsistency there is, the more people can see how the low-level things track to something important that feels important to them, and how the organization's high-level goal feels important to them as well, makes them feel better about themselves. That is something that helps people be gritty. Second thing is growth mindset, the sense that things can get better, things must get better. And I think I was hearing that throughout the talks I was hearing today. No one wants to rest on their laurels, in this organization, as far as I can tell, at least it's talking today. Pride and resilience, learning from setbacks, adapting to the unexpected, and then a strong group identity. Ultimately, there's such pride here in people, being part of Hogue, from what I can tell. And this isn't my only exposure to Hogue. Ultimately, we all want people to feel really proud to be part of, Providence St. Joe's, but also the teams and the units within Providence St. Joe's. So that's what this article is about, is to try to cultivate that, grit. But the way this fits together, my sort of summary thing, what all this was about to lead to this 1 minute to say is, this is how I think this stuff fits together. I think that, and why I want all of you to, I hope all of you will be ready to think and work at all these levels, because I think we need what Angela talks about to do what Lee Moore wants us to do, which is compete. compete on getting better and meeting our patients' needs. And if we're going to compete, we need what Michael Porter talks about. We need to be able to think clearly about strategy, what it means to, execute on the, and being different in meeting our patients' needs. And then if we're going to actually implement those strategies, we need what Ronald Byrd talks about. We need to be able to know how to work to create social capital. Financial capital is nice, but the truth is you can go to a bank and you can borrow money. You can't go to a bank and you can't go anywhere to get trust and respect and cooperation and reliability and the kinds of things that we're hearing about that create social capital. And then if you're going to have great teams, you have to be able to trust the people that you're working with. You need social norms. You know what to be able to expect, and you need people to feel proud to be part of that group. You need the stuff that Nicholas Christakis talks about. I actually, of course, this is my little framework now, and I'm imposing it on everything I hear. I've been hearing these things all day, every one of these things. So I hope that this kind of gossipy type framework may be helpful to you as you think about your work. Now I am a minute over, so let me turn it back to Amy to wrap it up for you.